This is convicted drug lord Jose Gavia Jimenez. Police say that Jimenez was working with a Mexican cartel to operate a heroin trafficking operation that brought as much as 100 kilos of the drug into Columbus every month. The investigation resulted in the seizure of 25 kilos of heroin, which was worth a whopping $2.5 million. Jimenez pleaded guilty to 2 counts of trafficking along with 1 count of engaging in corrupt activity and is appearing at the Franklin County Courthouse today for sentencing. Far from the heights of his glory days, as the ringleader of a Columbus drug operation, Jimenez shuffles into the courtroom wearing khaki prison-issued scrubs. However, he hasn't completely lost his sense of steely command as he shoots a quick icy stare at the narcotics investigators who are in court to see their hard work come to fruition. Assistant Prosecutor Dan Stanley begins the hearing by making Jimenez's high-ranking position within the operation abundantly clear.
He's the ringleader of an organization that is so fear-inspiring that the people who come here from Mexico refuse to testify against it because they know as soon as they are born, their family will be murdered in Mexico.
He also speaks of the fear-inducing power of the cartel and the difficulties this poses when trying to obtain convictions against gang members. All the while, Jimenez maintains his stance, standing bolt upright while glaring into the distance. A female witness who's not shown on camera to protect her identity gives evidence to the court about how she helped him store and move heroin in the Columbus area.
He was bringing me the drugs to my house.
What kind of drugs?
Heroin.
How much?
1 kilo, and the last time 2 kilos.
Watch Jimenez as she testifies. You'd be forgiven for thinking he was a statue, but if you look closely, you'll see that he does in fact blink. The ringleader has been stone cold up until now, and his lack of remorse is about to get clearer as he addresses the court through an interpreter.
This has been overblown.
Y pido perdón por lo que yo he hecho.
And I apologize.
Jimenez stands and expresses some form of apology curtly in Spanish, looking as if he's choking on every word. His translator manages to make his words sound more human in English. However, Judge Kimberly Koft isn't buying any of his feeble regret, and she takes him to task on his claims that his accountability has been inflated by the prosecution team.
I'm surprised to hear you saying today that your participation is overblown.
Judge Koft reminds him sharply that she informed him of his statutory requirements for a conviction before sentencing Jimenez to 21 years in prison. She also orders that the drug baron be deported immediately upon his discharge.
I was very intentional about explaining to you the statutory requirement for conviction.
Jimenez shows no reaction to the fact that he will be approaching 70 when he's released and instead just saunters from the courtroom with an expression of disdain on his face. Jimenez's total lack of emotion is unnerving, and as we see in the next case, Dexter Lee Williams shows a similar level of catatonic coldness. However, in Williams' case, someone else is getting worked up on his behalf.
I'm talking to Mr. Williams. I've heard everything.
Right, but you're holding, no, what other accusations? He didn't testify, so you're holding what I said.
I've heard everybody.
The 53-year-old kingpin is just about to be sentenced at Houston County Superior Court after being convicted on 3 counts of violating the Racketeer and Corrupt Organizations Act. The conviction stems from drug trafficking charges brought against Williams, who police said was leading a multi-million-dollar trafficking operation between Mexico and Atlanta. When taken into custody, he had 39 kilos of cocaine in his possession, worth an estimated $3.5 million. Here he is, talking and laughing to himself in the back of the police car following his arrest.
Son of a bitch, they thought me that fast. I should have never walked into that fucking house.
Sentencing Williams is Judge Bo Adams, and he has some strong words for the defendant, who sits impassively in his seat.
In your case, it's not a mere possession case. It's not a mere struggle that you have with an addiction that you personally have. It is not that. You are, I would say, you are feeding the addiction that they're battling with, and you are profiting from their addiction.
While Williams might be unmoved by Judge Adams, his defense attorney, Wanda Jackson, is growing noticeably agitated by the judge's words. She sighs and leans back irritably in her seat.
You're convicted not because the court is underhanded or corrupted or is corrupt or anything like that.
It seems that the penny finally drops for the defendant. The sentencing is not going well for him. He shares a look with Wanda Jackson, And what happens next is something you don't see too often in a sentencing hearing. Williams continues to stare on without emotion, while Wanda Jackson, having heard enough, incredibly takes issue with Judge Adams.
We talking about for me, Judge, you're holding what I said,
I'm talking to Mr. Williams, I've heard everything.
right, but you're holding, no, what other accusations? He didn't testify, so you're holding what I said.
I've heard everybody, I've heard it all.
Who else said it?
I've heard it all, it's my time.
She attempts to scold him for insinuating that her defense case was filled with wild accusations, but the judge cuts her off and goes on with his speech.
Mr. Williams, you're convicted not because I'm corrupt or underhanded, or law enforcement is racist, or the jury had unauthorized contact with witnesses. You're convicted because you're guilty. That's the plain and simple truth of it. The evidence showed that, the wiretaps show that, and at the end of it all, I find that
Jackson, however, remains unimpressed and can be seen gesturing with her hands and huffing. Judge Adams ultimately sentences Williams to a total of 40 years without parole, and even the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison isn't enough to stir a reaction from the stone-cold dealer.
I would say you should be sentenced for your involvement, your participation in this racketeering enterprise, and your acquiring significant sums of money.
Jackson is less than pleased, though she gathers her things and stands to leave before the judge has a chance to finish speaking.
That'll be the sentence of the court as a result of...
Thank you, my excuse.
All right.
And at the end of it all, for count one, I will sentence Mr. Williams to 20 years to serve. Count two, I will sentence him to 20 years. And that will be consecutive to count one, and I'm going to require that be served. 20 years to serve. Count three, I already indicated that is merged with count one. So that'll be the sentence of the...
For Williams, it was the allure of power and money that drew him to trafficking. But as we see in the case of Wallace Bigger, not all dealers live a lavish lifestyle.
The judge is biased, and as I said from the start, Andrew County would not to be a fair trial.
Police say that Bigger moved a significant pipeline of prescription drugs through Unum County in northern Michigan over the course of a number of years. The operation involved obtaining thousands of morphine pills and other controlled medications from a doctor in Sagen, which were then sold by Bigger from a number of locations across the county. However, despite bringing in more than $220,000 from the spoils of his illegal trade, Bigger barely got by, living in practical squalor in a camper van on his daughter's driveway. Throughout his trial, the 71-year-old remained defiant, protesting his innocence and berating his legal counsel and the criminal justice system as a whole. He tried to fire his lawyer on a number of occasions and claimed that he was framed by law enforcement officials. He was eventually convicted of conducting a criminal enterprise, the most serious charge possible under Michigan's racketeering laws. Today, Bigger is appearing before Judge Philip Rogers for sentencing. The judge doesn't hold back as he lays out the elderly drug lord's trashy living conditions and resentful nature.
You live a big lifestyle where you're sitting out next to the cement pond with the BMW parked in the driveway. No, you weren't. You lived a pretty crummy lifestyle, time to time, in a camper in your daughter's front driveway, but it didn't stop you from being manipulative. It didn't stop you from abusing other people.
Bigger is less than pleased, and when he approaches the podium to speak, what he has to say shocks the court.
I did not sell drugs, and I will not admit to nothing.
Maintaining his brazen pretense, the drug dealer continues to feign innocence. He then goes on to complain bitterly about his lawyer and even accuses Judge Rogers of being biased, repeating his claim that he did not get a fair trial.
I believe the judge is biased, and as I said from the start, Andrew County would not to be a fair trial. And I did not get a fair trial. And I got a screwy lawyer.
The prosecution team disregards his dubious claims, arguing that he was the main pill dealer in Antrim County. They appeal to the judge for the harshest sentence possible, wanting to use Wallace Bigger to set an example for any other would-be dealers.
He was the primary provider of morphine during that time period within Antrim County. He kept going back to Saginaw and was getting 800 pills a month, bringing them back here. Hopefully his sentencing at the high end of the guidelines and the consecutive nature will send a message to anybody that may want to fill that vacuum that regardless of your age, there is a consequence if you are caught trafficking this quantity of controlled substance.
Judge Rogers ultimately sentences Bigger to a minimum of 20 years in total, meaning he will likely never see the light of day again.
I am sentencing you to 180 to 360 months on charge number 1. On charge 2, the controlled substance delivery charge, 23 to 240 months. Charges 3 and 4, 23 to 240 months. On the maintaining a drug house, 16 to 24 months. And on conducting the criminal enterprise, that's 50 to 240.
Most drug lords, like Bigger, are convicted for possessing illegal substances with the intent to distribute and rarely face any charges in relation to the effect that their drugs have on their vulnerable customers. However, occasionally dealers are held to account for the consequences of their actions, and one such case is Aaron Andrade. The 25-year-old drug dealer is in court today for sentencing after admitting his part in the overdose death of 29-year-old Kristen Coutu. Coutu had left a drug treatment facility just 2 days before her death because her insurance wouldn't cover more than 30 days of inpatient treatment. On the day she died, she arranged to buy drugs from Andrade, but unknown to her, the heroin the dealer gave her was laced with a fatal dose of fentanyl.
The Attorney General says it's the first time a drug dealer has been convicted of murder of someone who overdosed, a landmark case with many implications for how the state will prosecute dealers.
Andrade pleaded no contest to second-degree murder in relation to Coutu's death in a plea agreement that saw 2 further drug charges against him dismissed. At sentencing, Judge Kristen Rogers hears submissions from the prosecution on the nature of the evidence they held against Andrade.
The state would have proven that what the defendant really sold Kristen Coutu was nearly pure fentanyl, a controlled substance like heroin or morphine, hundreds of times more toxic.
She asks the defendant if the facts of the case are true, and he admits that they are.
Are all of these facts true?
Yes, ma'am.
Kristen Coutu's mother then gives an emotional impact statement, recalling the horror of being told her daughter overdosed.
2 Cranston police officers standing there. All I could say repeatedly was, please don't tell me my daughter is dead. Please don't tell me my daughter is dead.
Family members look on in the public gallery, weeping, and Kristen's mom even has to stop at one stage so that a grieving relative can leave the room.
Sorry, it's okay. It's okay.
Following the impact statements, Andrade stands to speak, and what he says surprises the court.
A lot of people, including her family and mine, because we're all going through this.
Unlike most convicts, Andrade takes full responsibility for what he has done, expressing remorse and a clear understanding that his actions have caused untold grief for the Coutu family. However, Andrade's repentant words can't save him, and Judge Rogers hands him 40 years, with 20 to serve.
Your Honor, this defendant stands before you indicted on, among others, the count of murder for, as the state alleges, delivering a substance containing fentanyl which killed Kristen Coutu.
The remorseful dealer shows no visible reaction to the sentence as he calmly accepts his fate. While truly genuine remorse like Andrade's might be an unusual occurrence in the courtroom, most defendants will try to appear at least a little bit contrite when put before a judge. However, a small few, like Charles Crosty, are so cold and unapologetic that even a significant prison sentence doesn't stir a reaction from them. Crosty is in Clement County Court for sentencing on drug trafficking and corruption charges. The 35-year-old was found guilty on 12 counts after being caught in possession of $5,000 worth of heroin and cocaine that was intended for the streets of New Richmond. Crosty has a long criminal history spanning back to the age of 14, and police say he set up his dealing empire just 4 months after being released from a previous prison stint for trafficking heroin. The hearing kicks off with Assistant Prosecutor Darren Miller trying to impress on Judge Thomas Herman the extent of the damage done to the community by Crosty.
Heroin is bad enough, but laced with fentanyl, it becomes a game of Russian roulette. And individuals like Charles Crosty provide the weapon, they provide the bullet, and they spin the chamber, pointing at the addict's head, and all the addict has to do is pull the trigger. That's who Charles Crosty is.
Officials say that while the defendant was active, overdoses and drug-related deaths spiraled due to large amounts of fentanyl-laced heroin on the streets. Crosty's drug-dealing antics are scandalous enough, but when Police Chief Rand Harvey tells the court how he forced addicts to sell his products, the court is stunned by what he has to say.
They would have black eyes or their face would be swollen. And I would ask them, how did this occur? And they would frankly tell me that Charles Crosty and his associates associates would beat them.
You heard right, Crosty would feed the addictions of his customers and then beat them senseless until they agreed to sell drugs on the streets for him. Crosty seemingly couldn't care less about his horrific actions being laid bare to the court and simply rolls his eyes as Harvey speaks. The defendant continues to stare vacantly as Judge Herman lists off his lengthy criminal record before sentencing him to 20 years and 9 months in prison. True to form, Crosty doesn't even flinch as the sentence is handed down. Thankfully for New Richmond residents, their town will now be safer for a long time to come. While many kingpins like Crosty prefer the ultimate power and glory of working alone, a small few choose to tag team their responsibilities, and as we see in the next case, some even choose to make it a family business. This is Rashad Johnson and his brother Marquez Johnson. The Jacksonville siblings are appearing before Duval County Judge R. Anthony Salem for sentencing after being tried together and convicted of drug trafficking and possession charges. Their arrests came after police raided a trap house on the east side of Jacksonville, and the charges they were convicted of had drug enhancements because both men were identified as leaders of the ruthless 1200 Out East gang. Watch the brotherly love as Marquez shoots Rashad a nod of acknowledgement prior to sentencing. Members of the Johnson family file into the witness box to plead for leniency, telling the judge that the men have 7 kids between them.
I often think about the things I could have been different as a parent. I know my sons could have had a better outcome in life.
And he's a family man?
He is.
And do you feel he's a good father?
He's a great father. Your Honor, I pray and ask the true merciful. I pray that there's some resources to help them grow.
Then the brothers take it in turns to address the judge.
I don't know what kind of sentence you will hand out today, but I would ask that you be lenient towards me. I have a beautiful family, which includes 4 kids and a stepchild. I am not a bad person. I'm not a monster. I'm not a gamer. Just a human being who made mistakes.
And throws himself at the mercy of Judge Salem, claiming to simply be a man who has made mistakes. In a similar vein, Marquez denies any involvement in gang activity.
I am not labeled as a menace, an animal, or a gang member, or in my community or anywhere else. And I just want to say I'm sorry to my family once again for putting me through the situation and letting them down.
Prosecutors aren't buying it, and they argue that the Johnson brothers had plenty of opportunity to clean up their act, but continued to engage in gang-related activities.
They had the opportunity to better their lives after serving 3 years in the Florida State Prison, and they came back out and continued doing the same pattern of criminal activity that they've been arrested so many times before for. They even moved out of their community. But instead of staying out of their community and getting jobs, the court has heard nothing from any of these witnesses about legal jobs that they had. They provided for their families financially, but how are they doing that? By selling drugs.
The men stand side by side to hear their fate, and with the futures of 2 men hanging in the balance, it seems like Judge Salem has a heavy decision to make. The sentence he hands down stuns the courtroom.
Adjudicated guilty, sentenced to 30 years Florida State Prison, with 581 days.
Loud sobs echo through the public gallery from the men's supporters as a hefty 30-year sentence is imposed on both brothers. As upset as the men's family members may be, the brothers seem to be taking their 3-decade punishment in stride. Rashad turns and waves goodbye to his family without a trace of sadness as he is led from the courtroom. The Johnson brothers' sentences may seem heavy to some. As the Johnson brothers are escorted out of the courtroom, their faces remain stoic, unaffected by the heavy sentence they have just received. The courtroom, filled with tension and emotion, begins to settle as the reality of their 30-year conviction sinks in. Their supporters, visibly shaken, continue to sob, but the brothers themselves display no outward signs of remorse, their expressions unchanged as they walk away from the life they once knew. The sound of their departure echoes in the hushed room, leaving behind a sense of finality. Judge Salem's decision, though harsh, serves as a reminder of the consequences of involvement in violent, organized criminal activity. While family members mourn the loss of their loved ones to the prison system, the community breathes a sigh of relief, knowing that 2 of Jacksonville's most notorious drug traffickers are now off the streets. In the end, the case of the Johnson brothers stands as a stark illustration of how even those bound by blood can be brought to justice for the destructive paths they choose. As we reflect on the courtroom dramas we've witnessed today, from the cold indifference of drug lords like Jimenez and Williams to the emotional plea of Andrade's remorse, it's clear that the fight against organized crime is relentless. Whether it's through the harsh words of a judge, the emotional testimony of grieving families, or the unwavering determination of law enforcement, justice seeks to ensure that those who profit from the suffering of others will ultimately face the consequences. And so, with the closing of this chapter, we leave you with the reminder that while some may escape the law for a time, justice has a way of catching up sooner or later. Thank you for joining us today, and be sure to stay tuned for more stories of justice, redemption, and the long road to accountability.